Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and in today's lesson, we're going to be primarily revolving around two statements in the book of Genesis pertaining to Abraham, the patriarch and progenitor of the Jewish people, and we're going to be exploring the echo of these words not only throughout the book of Genesis but in the New Testament. So the lesson was not lost on many of these descendants of Abraham. The earliest Christians were in fact Jews, and they applied many of the blessings and extended them to Gentiles, which, as we will read in the opening passage, was the entire reach of the Abrahamic blessing. So the first passage we're going to be covering is Genesis 12, 1 through 5, and in the early portion of this passage, Abraham receives his calling, and there are blessings that come with that calling, as we will read. And he's introduced earlier as a son of Terah in the 11th chapter, and he was a citizen of Ur, which was an ancient city of Mesopotamia founded by Sumerians, the original civilized people. So he lived a comfortable, settled city life, and he's called to be a nomad, to settle a promised land and to father an entire nation. And the problem with that is that his wife is past the childbearing age, but his name, he's originally called Abram, but Abraham, the name that he's earned and is given, means father of many nations. So the opening verse of the 12th chapter reads, "And Yahweh said to Abram, Go yourself out of your land, from your relatives, and from your father's house, to a land which I show you." So he's asking him to stop everything, pack everything up, leave. He's got to leave his home, his familiar surrounding, his friends, his family, and the place he's comfortable and familiar with, all to go to an unknown land, which he's going to show to him, but it's still a mystery as to what is in that land. "And I shall make you a great nation, and bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." So the byproduct of being blessed is that we become a blessing unto others. Blessings are not meant to be hoarded by the blessed, but to overflow and to extend to others. And this is the just response for being blessed, is to extend and share that blessing. "And I shall bless those who bless you, and curse him who curses you. And in you all the clans of the earth shall be blessed." So he promises him that any blessing or cursing which is sent in his way is in effect a blessing or a cursing on Yahweh himself, and he will respond accordingly by blessing those who bless him and cursing those who curse them with an even greater curse than they issued or ultimatum. So throughout human history, there's been several civilizations that enslaved, oppressed, and some which even tried to exterminate the Jews, but it has not ended well for any of those nations. Those mighty empires are no longer with us, whereas the nation and people of Israel very much are. And the blessing that would come to all the Gentiles would, its ultimate manifestation was to be found in Yahshua the Messiah, who was the Messiah who was promised to Adam and Eve, that would spring from the son, would be a child of Eve. In other words, he would not be the Redeemer for sin, would not be an angel, but a human, and then that is eventually narrowed down to a descendant of Abraham, a Jew, an Israelite. "So Abraham left, as Yahweh had commanded him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran." So Lot was his nephew. The genealogy of his family is described in the final verses of the preceding chapters. Lot would also be the progenitor or the father of the Ammonites and Moabites through his incestuous liaison with his children, and these would be a perpetual nuisance to the nation of Israel. And this was because he went to Sodom, and he was called out by Abraham, who received a revelation that the city was going to be smolder in ruins because its sin had provoked the wrath of Yahweh. But his wife looked back and was turned into a stone. And but he was 75 years old. He lived to be 175 years old, which was longer than at ordinary lifespan. But this was not quite so early post-Diluvian, when the window of time span and lifespan would have been, sin would have taken its toll and effect and reduced it to the 900 plus years most of the sons of Seth enjoyed. And Abraham took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the beings whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed for the land of Canaan, and they came to the land of Canaan. So Sarai was his wife, who's eventually renamed Sarah, which means princess, and Lot is his nephew. And so they took all their belongings, all their possessions, all their servants with them that they had known in here identified as Haran, and they left. They picked up everything, got everything, and left to the land of Canaan, which was to be their promised land. And they got there. And we also read an echo of some of the words in Genesis 22:18. This is the chapter where Abraham is asked to offer his promised son Isaac, the son of the covenant, on an altar, and because he obeys, Yahweh tells him, "And in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Now, what he was asking him to do was a difficult thing to do. He was asking him to sacrifice his own son, who was also the promise was vested of the covenant nation, and because he did so, and Yahweh interjected a ram at the last moment in time, he would be blessed, and the promise would remain in perpetuity. And the other one we read is in 18:18, which reads, since this is in the context of his planning to wipe out the entire city of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so because Abraham is such a faithful servant, he plans to at least tell him what his plan is. And he says, "Since Abraham is certainly going to be a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him." So this is in the form of the question. The earlier verse reads, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing?" And because he didn't hide it from Abraham, Abraham was able to call Lot, whose wife unfortunately didn't make it, out of the city to save itself from meeting the destruction, the fire and brimstone which he would otherwise endure had he remained. And this, the opening verse of Genesis finds its echo in the book of Hebrews, the great chapter of faith, the 11th chapter of that book. We're going to read the 8th and 9th verses. "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out of the place which he was about to receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going." So remember, in the opening verse, there was a mystery of it. He just told him, "A land you have not seen, you will not know, you will know, it will be yours. It is promised to you, and your descendants will dwell in there, and it will be theirs." And this was an act of faith. Every act of obedience is an act of faith. And he didn't even know, it wasn't immediately promised that this would be the promised land to him. That was because he progressively followed by faith. And the 9th verse reads, "By faith he sojourned in the land of promise as a stranger, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with the same promise." So he was, prior to his calling, for the first 75 years of his life, he had lived as an urban, settled person in a settled location. He was asked to give that up and live the life of a wandering nomad, and that he did by faith. And the promise was inherited and passed down from him to Isaac and Jacob. Isaac was also the son of not Abraham's only son. He also fathered the Midianite people and fathered the Muslim people through Ishmael, his child, through his wife's servant girl Hagar, who was an Egyptian, and Jacob's older twin brother Esau. Now Isaac wanted to pass him the blessing, but Jacob, whose name means deceiver, tricked Esau, who was a carnal man, and it was at his wife's direction, and he became the child of promise. The people of promise would go through him. And now we're going to read Galatians, the 3rd chapter, beginning with the 8th verse, which reads, "And the scripture, having foreseen that Elohim would justify the nations by faith, announced the good news to Abraham before saying, 'All the nations shall be blessed in you.'" So this is a reminder of the promise which had been bestowed upon Abraham. And because all the nations, that would mean the Gentiles. Now the people who sprang from his loins and from Isaac's and Jacob's loins would be known as the chosen people, the Israelites. Everyone else would be known as a Gentile. But their entire purpose for existence and reason for being blessed was to be a blessing unto these people. And by the dawn of the new covenant, justification by faith was the message, and the avenue of it was spread to Gentiles through men like Paul, who was the apostle and evangelist to the Gentiles. And now we're going to read 14 through 16 in the same chapter. "In order that the blessing of Abraham might come upon the nations in Messiah Yahshua, to receive the promise of the Spirit through belief." So the blessing, the singular blessing, is concentrated on his biological descendant, who was also at the same time the son of Elohim, born of a virgin, who was a descendant of Abraham by the name of Mary. She was also a descendant of David, the king who established the throne which ruled from Jerusalem, at least until their exile in 586 BM before Messiah. "Brothers, as a man I say it, a covenant, even though it is a man's, yet it is confirmed. No one puts it aside or adds to it. But the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to seeds, as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Messiah." So Paul is careful to note and point out that the tension of the word in the promise is singular. It's not plural, so the blessing was to be concentrated in a single descendant of his, and that was the greatest man who ever lived, who turned the world and history upside down, and it was through him that the nations, the blessings would ultimately, the Gentile nations would also ultimately receive the blessings. And now the second statement of which we read of Abraham is to be found in the 5th and the 6th verse of the 15th chapter of Abraham. And they read, "And he brought him outside and said, 'Look now towards the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them.' And he said to him, 'So are your seed.'" So Abraham was also promised, when he looked at the dust on the ground, he would have a reminder of how numerous his descendants would be. So whether he looked down below or above him in the sky, he would always have the reminder of the promise. So as many stars as there were, and stars would have been a lot more numerous. In pre-industrial societies, light pollution has unfortunately distorted the visibility of much of the heavenly bodies, but if you go to the clean country air, you can see exactly how many stars there are. There are numerous, and he also the point is that if he looks up or down, he will never forget the promise which awaits him. And the 6th verse reads, "And he believed in Yahweh, and he was reckoned it to him for righteousness." So having faith is identified as a species of righteousness. The righteous shall live by faith, the prophet Habakkuk writes in the 2nd chapter of the 4th verse of the book which bears his name. This concept is repeated thrice throughout the phrase is repeated thrice throughout the New Testament. those being Romans 1:17, Galatians 3:11, and Hebrews 10:38. So, and we also read in Genesis 22:17, which corresponds to the fourth verse, or the fifth verse, rather. This is when Abraham offers Isaac. It's that scene on Mount Moriah. And I shall certainly bless you, and I shall increase your seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and let your seed possess the gate of their enemies. So this is a promise made to him in response to his great obedience. Because he had obeyed, he had proven himself worthy of the promise and the covenant, and that the covenant entailed that wherever he looked, be it on the ground, the dust of the earth, the sand of the seashore, or the stars in the heaven, he would always have that reminder. And we also read something similar in Genesis 26:4. And I shall increase your seed like the stars of the heavens, and I shall give all these lands to your seed, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So not only would they be blessed with a land and a progeny and a community of people with similar backgrounds forming a common ethnicity, but they would also be a blessing to all the nations around them. And we're now going to turn to Romans 4:18, which reads, this is Paul writing in reference to Abraham, who against expectation believed in hope, so that he could become father of many nations, according to what was said, so shall your seed be. So this was an act of faith to accept a promise which he could not live to witness, but he had the ironclad guarantee that several centuries from now he would have a nation, a sizable body of people who descended from him, and they would be settled in a land of milk and honey, which had been promised to him. And the next passage we're going to read is James 2:21-23. And it reads, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? So justification by faith. Now to James, justification by anything outside of faith or grace is wrong. But we have to understand that in the wider context, beginning in the 14th verse all the way to the 26th verse, James establishes that works and faith are virtually synonymous and interchangeable. And so it was both a work and an act of faith when Abraham offered Isaac, his son, on the altar to be sacrificed, the seed of his hope and all the expected blessings. Do you see that the faith was doing with his works, and by the works the faith was perfected? So it wasn't enough to believe that Yahweh would deliver. He actually had to physically place him there in a situation where he could slaughter him in order to prove that belief. And the belief was manifested when at the last minute an angel, Abraham as he was known at this point, had the knife in midair, and an angel stopped him and placed a sacrificial ram where Isaac was once laying. And the scripture was filled, which says, Abraham believed Elohim, and it was reckoned to him for righteousness, and he was called Elohim's friend. So this is reminds us of Genesis 15:16, where he was, because he believed, because he had faith, it was imputed or reckoned, the righteousness was imputed or reckoned unto him. And he is also identified as a friend of Elohim. That is a privileged and exalting standard that the Son calls us to in the 15th chapter of John. Now he elevates us above that of the mere servant. Now we're going to return to the book of Romans, which read the 4th chapter, first verse through the 3rd. What then shall we say? Abraham our father, to have found according to the flesh. So Abraham our father would have been their biological progenitor, the father of their nation from whom they all descended. For if Abraham was justified by works, he was boasting, but not before Elohim. So Paul argues differently than James. James says that he was justified by works and faith. To Paul, the faith is such an insignificant component that he expels it from the actual equation. Yes, Abraham did prove his faith through a work, but to Paul, the work was inconsequential in balance to the faith. What does the scripture say? Abraham believed Yahweh, and it was reckoned to him for righteousness. Once again, this is a quotation of Genesis 15:6, of which we've heard before, and there's nothing new we can add to it in this context, only to compare it to James' outlook. And the 9th verse of the same chapter, Romans 4, reads, "In this blessing, then, upon the circumcised or upon the uncircumcised, for we affirm, faith was reckoned unto Abraham for righteousness." So the path for Jew and Gentile is both by faith. That's how they're justified. That's how they're determined righteous, and that is all it takes for them, whether they're circumcised or not. The path of faith is necessary and essential for us all, regardless of our background. And the 13th verse of the same chapter reads, "For the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the Torah, but through a righteousness of belief." So the promise of a nation and a people and a promised land of milk and honey was not, he's demoting the significance of the law, which many Jews, legalistic Jews, Paul was certainly one of them, thought was a source of justification. But it is righteousness through faith. Paul is one of the people who quotes Habakkuk 2:4 in Romans 1:17. And we're just going to close with some more readings from the 3rd chapter in the book of Galatians, beginning with the 6th and 7th verse, and then we're going to read the 9, and that's going to be it for today. "Even so, Abraham believed Elohim, and it was reckoned unto him as righteousness. Know then that those who are of faith are sons of Abraham." So whether Jew or Gentile, whether we have faith is what our ethnic background is inconsequential to the faith we have and hold. If we have faith, then we have a greater claim to being a son of Abraham, who was a man of faith, who lived by faith and walked by faith, than any biological descendant of his who doesn't live by faith and is not a man of faith. And the last verse is then, "So that those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham, the believer." So the believer, the one who has faith, is entitled to, can expect, and will share in the Abrahamic blessing, which is more extensive to his progeny alone, but extends across the entire earth for all times, now and forever, including and especially right now. So all we have to do is seize and lay hold of the faith, and then we may be called the child of Abraham and experience the promised blessings that privileged position entails. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned till next time. Bye-bye.